Okay, we are using this book as an outline, and I'm supplementing different items on my own study to use in relationship to these six topics that we're covering over the next several weeks. We had an introduction, and we talked last time about economics, and today we're going to talk a little bit about enslavement. Boy, this is a fascinating study, and it required me to kind of go back beyond the way Jesus uses the idea of slavery in some of his teachings to kind of get a running start from the Old Testament. So we're going to start this topic actually in the Old Testament and get kind of a run up to the time of Jesus to see what he has to say about this idea. Now, when we talk about slavery and we talk about enslavement, we need to do a little bit of uh, definition. So, the first couple of slides I'm going to show you here will help us kind of define what we're talking about. So, when we talk about Jesus for everyone, not just for Christians, you'll come across verses like this on occasion in the Gospels. Jesus says, "Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all." And it's interesting to kind of think a little bit about what he had in mind when he uses this type of language. So let's get started first with a little bit of introduction and then a run up to the New Testament. So the language of slavery or enslavement is one that is sometimes uneasy to talk about, especially in our country and as we consider some of our history. And it also brings up accompanying subjects as well that relate to race, privilege, reparations sometimes comes into the discussion as well. And while we are hesitant at times to talk about this topic, the Bible is not hesitant about it. And it is full of references to slaves and episodes and stories that relate to slaves. Some of them are quite fascinating. We're going to see one in the New Testament, we'll see in a few moments, that causes us to come away with more questions than we have answers. Uh, the thing to keep in mind about this subject is like with many other subjects in the Bible, you don't always have just a singular message on that particular topic. In other words, the Bible isn't monofocused in that particular topic. It has various perspectives, and sometimes it is used in the positive, and sometimes it's used in the negative. So you see on the slide there that the very defining essence of the nation of Israel is related to their release from slavery. The Exodus story is their defining story, and it is a story that usually is brought into not just observations of Passover and observance of the Seder, it is touched upon in a variety of different ways. And you see that reflected in the prophets, such as Isaiah 58 and some other places like that. And what you find is that at times it's a part of their history, it's a part of their self definition to be once slaves, but now free. And at other times, the prophets come out with gangbusters against slavery and they condemn a lot of the issues that are related to it. In particular, Isaiah, Amos. Amos is probably the most notable, and it is the prophet that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used quite extensively in the civil rights movement. Um, we can kind of sometimes assume that Jesus was just against slavery. We could turn to a chapter like Luke chapter 4, where he gets up and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue, and he kind of evokes an image of the year of Jubilee, which is a year that slaves are supposedly to be set free from their enslavement, as is outlined in Leviticus 25. Um, he talks about how the oppressed are to go free. And then all you need to do is turn a few pages later, and you see in some of his other teachings, he seems to accept it as just a standard way of life in the first century. So you have to kind of work through the complexity of this a little bit. And when you do, it brings us back to what are we talking about when we're talking about slavery? Well, in historical terms, I think most of all, we think of slavery in terms of what is called chattel slavery. In other words, individuals are treated as property. They're bought, they're sold, they're owned. This is probably the one that is most notorious and the one that we see John Newton repenting of when he writes the great hymn Amazing Grace, as he was once a slave owner and so forth. But there are other kind of ways of looking at this topic. There is what is called indentured servitude. And technically, it's not slavery, but it is a contractual agreement where people kind of work for a master for a period of time so that they can then receive some benefits. So, in the case of our own history, there were slaves that worked for a period of time in exchange for a passage to the new world to start a new life over. You get sometimes terms like bondage, a term that is often used where people are bound and forced into servitude. Sometimes it's interchangeably used with the word slavery, but there are subtle differences to it. Serfdom, that comes out of the Middle Ages when in medieval Europe, peasants were often bound to the land that they worked on, and they were under the control of those who owned the land. So while serfs were not technically slaves, yet they didn't have uh, absolute freedom. They were bound under certain rules. Couple more here. Slave trade, the practice of capturing, buying, and selling individuals as slaves. You have examples of this even in the Bible. Joseph in the book of Genesis is an example of that. And then finally, triangular trade, the idea of more than two countries being involved. So this is interesting. In the transatlantic trade routes, slaves are transported from Africa to America. Raw materials often were then sent from America to Europe, and then manufactured goods were sent from Europe back to Africa. So that's why it's called triangular trade. We were the ones that received humans, whereas the other nations received merchandise and materials. Okay, so that helps us a little bit. Um, one of the things you're going to find in the scripture is indentured servitude. You will find slaves as well that are bought and sold as well. Now, when we talk about slavery, it can relate to a lot of different things. It could relate to human trafficking. It can relate to forced labor of some sort where people are being held against their will for the work that they can produce. Um, there are people that are in bondage economically and otherwise because they're forced to repay a debt. And sometimes there's exploitive conditions that are related to that to kind of work off their debt. Here's one that is sad where there are cases where child labor is a form of slavery where um, children are used in factories and other type of things that are quite dangerous because they're cheap to produce products and stuff. And then modern slavery can range anything from human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor. So that's a little bit of background information in case that helps you at all. Um, Probably three words are important when we think about this topic of slavery: oppression of some sort, servitude of some sort, where autonomy is limited, and exploitation of some sort, where people are being used, they're being stripped of their rights to be to the advantage of the individual that owns them. Now we come to the Bible. Okay, so I'm not going to turn to every passage I have in your handout, but I will highlight a couple of places where I want to show you some some different verses that maybe you've observed before, maybe you haven't. And so I'm in Exodus, the book of Exodus, and I mentioned a moment ago that the Exodus story is a way of self-definition for the nation of Israel. And Israel's view of slavery has historical, cultural, and religious influences upon it. And what we find is that Israel, in many ways, they begin to move the topic forward from where it is in the world at its time, because some of the laws that are enacted actually do help those who are enslaved. So when you look at the Bible, slavery begins pretty early. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, enslaved Hagar. She was often it's translated a handmaiden or something like that, uh, which is another issue. When you come to translation, you're going to have words that are used in the Bible that excuse me, should be translated slave, but sometimes they're translated in softer versions. In the New Testament, a lot of times where you see the word servant is actually the word doulos, which is a slave. And we'll come to that in a few moments. So here in Exodus, uh, Israel kind of is defining its existence as one from slavery to freedom. So this is how Exodus 20, where the giving of the Ten Commandments are found. It says, then God spoke all these words. He has 10 words. That's what the idea of the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So now we have this beginning of self-definition, and it runs through chapter 20. When you come down to verse 8 in chapter 20, when you have the commandment of the Sabbath day, it's interesting. In verse 9, it says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and you shall not do any work. And it could end there. You could put the period there, but it goes on and says, you're not to do any work, your son's not to do any work, your daughter's not to do any work, and your male and female slaves are not to do any work. So that is a movement forward. They are not worked where there are slaves, they are not to be worked 7 days a week. They are to be given a Sabbath day off. And there's the religious context coming into play there. To be a good covenant community, you need to keep these commandments, and that does have application to slaves. Now, some of the biblical laws concerning slavery is interesting. There's a bit of a difference between Hebrew slaves and non-Hebrew slaves. And so one of the things you're going to find in the scriptures is where there are Hebrew slaves, they are better regulated under a system of laws that provide them a little bit more protection and a little bit more freedom. So if a person sells themselves because they are in debt to someone else into some type of service, it's to be a temporary service. We are told in Leviticus, under the idea of the year of Jubilee, that every 50 years, all the slaves are to be set free, whether their debt has been fully paid off or not. So that, there's a limitation to that. Now, here in Exodus 21, there's also a limitation on the duration of service for Israelite slaves. So in chapter 21, verse 2, it says, when you buy a male Hebrew slave, these are Jewish people buying other Jewish people to be their slaves. It says, he shall serve 6 years, but in the seventh, he shall go out a free person without debt. So, what is kind of encapsulated in the year of Jubilee for Hebrew slaves, it is something that is to be done every seventh year, which is fascinating. And then the treatment is another element as well. So they're entitled, as we mentioned before, to rest on the Sabbath. But here's an interesting one in the same chapter. In chapter 21, it says in verse 26, when a slave owner strikes the eye of a male or female slave, destroying it, in other words, they put the eye out of a male or female slave, the owner shall let the slave go, a free person, to compensate for the eye. And of course, that's a part of the bigger idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth regulation that is found in the Torah. And it goes out on and says in verse 7, if the owner knocks out a tooth of a male or female slave, the slave shall be let go, a free person, to compensate for the tooth. Now, we might double back and say, yeah, but they're mistreating these people pretty bad that they're gouging out an eye or they're putting out a tooth. So it's not something that this is like the butler or something. These are still people being treated as slaves, and sometimes they're being abused, but there's a limitation to it. But for non-Israelite slaves, there's not as much restriction as you find against the kin. And what you find here is there is yet again some limitations. But I want you to notice this passage in Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46. I won't read it, but non-Israelite slaves could be enslaved for life. There is no out for them. So they are not to be set free after a certain period of time. Yet they are regulated by the Torah law, and they are supposed to be given a day of rest on the Sabbath. So there's kind of an umbrella of protection there for them, that they're not working 7 days a week, which would obviously be more productive financially for the slave owner. So we're getting a running start up to the New Testament. So what we've said so far is basically this. The Exodus story as a liberation is a self-defining story of the Israelites. They are people that were former slaves, and now they've been set free, and there is a movement forward toward greater justice, compassion, and freedom. Then there is the prophetic criticism. Amos and Isaiah, in particular, criticize slave owners who are not honoring the Torah regulations that have been laid down. They're ignoring them, and they are abusing their slaves. And so Amos talks about justice rolling down like a mighty river, and some of those grand images that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used in his I Have a Dream speech. But anyways, so those are kind of the two things that we take away from the Old Testament. And the best thing to say to it at this point is that the Torah grounds morality towards slaves in the Egyptian experience. So I'm going to turn to Deuteronomy just for a second, a couple books over. And here's a fascinating a couple of verses here that Israel is never to forget their former status. So in Deuteronomy chapter 5, if you come down to verse 15, it says here, in the giving of the law, again, the second giving of the law, that's what Deuteronomy means, the second giving of the law. It says, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And of course, that applies to the slaves as well. One more out of Deuteronomy 15 and verse 12. When you come to Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 12, it's reiterated again, a second time, that verse 12 says, if a member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and works for 6 years, in the 7th year you shall set that person free. So there is a limitation. And the question I think that we need to ask at this point is, why would Hebrew men own other Hebrew men and women? Well, you see at the bottom of the slide there, sometimes because of circumstances. Um, there are times when Israelites became so impoverished that the only way that they could make ends meet to put food on the table for their family would to be arrange some type of slave relationship. Um, they sometimes are considered to be hired laborers. Um, but again, in Deuteronomy 15, they are not to be permanent slaves. So all of that is a backdrop to help us get to the New Testament and to the things that Jesus taught about. Incidentally, the Exodus story was not just a prominent story for the Israelites. It became kind of a flag to wave for even non-Israelite nations, that there would be those that were enslaved in their own situation that would look to this story as a story of hope, that someday they too could be set free from their slavery. And incidentally, that's where a lot of the African American spirituals come from. A lot of the songs that were sung on the plantation used a lot of Exodus imagery, thinking that someday they will be able to be set free and have a life of their own and have freedom and so forth. So it is a bigger image than just for the Israelites. It becomes an international image that has been employed by various people in various times. Okay, now we come to the New Testament. And the word that is used for slave is doulos in Greek. That is important to keep in the back of your mind, because that word occurs over 100 times in the New Testament. And it is something that kind of represents the Roman imperial context, but then it becomes something more. It becomes a symbol of being freed spiritually too. Okay. And I'll show you a slide on that at the very end. But in the first century, it was believed that a third of the population were slaves in the Roman Empire. And they were bought and sold, and they had breeding of other human beings for the sole purpose of being slaves their entire lives. Now, depending upon the circumstance in the New Testament, some slaves could buy their freedom. And how they would come up with the resources to make that happen varies, but there is a situation where there were some that were former slaves, but now they're free. Incidentally, there is a translation of the term doulos that is one that is kind of like a bond servant. You've heard of that term. And that is kind of representative of some slaves felt that it'd be better either because they loved their master or because of their circumstance, it would be better to stay a slave where they have shelter and food than to be homeless and not have food to eat or shelter from the elements. Now, the New Testament never comes out directly and condemns slavery. That's a bit troubling. It does enshrine slavery almost. The Apostle Paul advises certain people in the assemblies in Corinth who are slaves but were permitted to be a part of the worshiping community. He'll say something like, stay in the state in which you were called and be content in the state in which you are called. Then he will also use what is called household codes, in particular, Ephesians, Colossians, First Timothy, talks about slaves. Slaves, obey your masters, you know. So the household code is wives, submit to your husbands, children, obey your parents, slaves, obey your masters. So the New Testament kind of enshrines slavery in the sense that this is the way it is. This is just the way life works. And we need slaves and they need us. And as a result of that, it seems as though there is a sense of a permanent institution that's not going to go away anytime soon. All right. Now that brings us to Jesus. What does he do with this topic? Well, the first thing to notice is he encounters all kinds of slaves in his ministry, individuals that are enslaved to someone else. And he does not choose to say, you need to be set free. He sends them back to their situation. And I think some of his teachings actually would kind of lose their punch a little bit if you take away the slave language, which translators sometimes do. They try to soften it. So the word doulos might be used of a woman, and instead of translating it slave, it is translated maid, M-A-I-D. Sometimes the word doulos is used for a man, and it's not translated a slave, it's translated servant, which seems to be more voluntary almost. Now, you have to understand that words have elasticity to them. So the same word doulos could apply to a servant, but that's a translator's decision. And to make that decision, they have to interpret it. Okay, so there is no interpretless translation. Every translator is interpreting something by the way they're translating the words. So Jesus sometimes will depict enslaved people in his stories, and he doesn't condemn it. And we'll give you some examples of that. But I'm going to turn to the book of Luke. So we're going to be in the book of Luke for a couple of illustrations with the time that we have remaining tonight. And the first one is the famous parable of the prodigal son in chapter 15. Now that's a long passage, and you know the push and pull of that parable. But maybe you've never noticed this. When the prodigal comes back, and the father throws a big party for him and says, my son was lost, but now he's returned. The older brother gets ticked off. And it's interesting the way he describes himself in verse 29. So he's talking to his father, and he says to his father, listen, for all these years, I have been working like a doulos for you, a slave for you. Uh, Fascinating that Jesus puts the slave words in the mouth of the older brother. Just listen to how this sounds. For all these years, I have not had any freedom. For all these years, I've been overworked. For all these years, I have not been appreciated. For all these years, I've worked like a slave for you. Now, if you dumb that down a little bit and you say, well, I have worked for you as a faithful son, it just doesn't have the punch, does it? The parable has power because of that word usage in the story. Okay, so now go to chapter 7. This is a fascinating one. So you are familiar with the healing of the centurion's servant. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Okay, let's read this one. It's not too long. Beginning of verse 1. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave. Now, I'm reading that from the New Revised Standard Version. And the reason I'm reading it from that is because it is one of the best translations there is out there in the English language. I bet it doesn't say that in the NIV. What does it say? You have it there.
Servant.
Servant. So that word that is used in the NIV translation as a servant. Okay. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his doulos, slave. Again, NIV, what? Servant. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, he is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us. He's a patron of the synagogue. He put out money to provide a place of meeting for these Jewish elders and the people. So he's highly regarded, even though he's a part of the Roman military. And Jesus went with them. But when he was not too far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but only speak the word, and let my servant be healed. Now, here in the New Revised Standard Version, it's not used as slave, it's servant. Okay? Actually, it's not servant, but it is in Greek. If you take a look at it in the original language, it's supposed to be translated my boy. So let's read it that way. But only speak the word and let my boy be healed. Boy, that brings a lot of fascinating dynamics into this story. Let's finish it though. For I also am a man set under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and the slave does it. So it goes back to slave, all right? When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. Turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Okay, so this story is fascinating. Jesus never condemns the fact that the centurion has a slave. He actually commends the centurion for his faith. This seems to be a slave. How do I know that? Because of what he says. If I tell my slave to do this, he does it. Right? Okay. Now, he is highly looked upon as a patron of the synagogue, and he expects a favor in return. That's what this is all about. I built you a synagogue. You Jewish elders go to Jesus, and my doulos, my slave, is ill and almost to the point of death. I want you to heal. I want him to heal him. And then he switches the term in verse 7. He says, my boy, let my boy be healed. Now, you can go in a variety of directions with this. Is that just a term of affection? Is it an indication of the age? Is this a very young child slave? Is it a put down? I don't think so, because he's begging Jesus for the healing. Is it an indication of an intimate relationship between two? So in the Roman world, you could have slaves, but there were also males that were used for intimacy and sexual relationships too. Now, we don't know. There's no way of knowing, but it's just fascinating that the term was changed at that one verse. Throughout the rest of the story, it is the term that is used for slave. Jesus never condemns it. And if this term, my boy, indicates an underage type individual, you think Jesus would say something about that. If it was someone that was owned for sexual pleasures, you would think Jesus would condemn that, but Jesus doesn't condemn this man. He commends him for his faith. So it seems as though Jesus is okay with the fact that some people have slaves, and there's no condemnation of it. So got to kind of keep that out there for a moment. We won't turn to this one, but you know the story in the garden when Jesus is betrayed. Peter pulls out a sword, cuts off the ear of an individual, and he cuts off the ear of a doulos, a slave. And in John 18:10, we're given that individual's name. His name is Malchus. And then Jesus proceeds to heal the slave's ear. Okay. Um, Next, when you look at the parables, my goodness, all of these parables, um, when Jesus is using this as a teaching tool, he allows people to be shamed, beaten, dismembered, tortured, killed, and stoned in the stories. Again, there's the punch, there's the power behind it. The wicked tenants parable. It could be seen as a parable of victims and victimizers. And that one is told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the non canonical Gospel of Thomas as well. Fascinating that that one. And then the talents, the talents where so many talents are given to people, and then what they do with it, they're given more, that type of thing. Those who don't produce, those talents are taken away. And it then says these slaves are cast into outer darkness. So if we are looking to Jesus to kind of give us a clear cut slavery is absolutely wrong, you're going to have a hard time with it. However, one of the things that you're going to see, though, is that Jesus not only uses that in his teachings, he does it as part of his own self definition. So in John chapter 13, when the disciples are coming into the upper room, it's not a servant, it's not a slave that washes the disciples' feet. Jesus puts himself in the role of a slave or a servant, wraps a towel around himself, and washes the disciples' feet. Now, I am going to turn to this one, Philippians chapter 2. In Philippians chapter 2, you have what is called the kenosis passage. This is a passage that talks about Jesus's role in the world. Okay. And you know this passage. Some think it might have actually been an early hymn. But this is where it begins. In verse 5, Paul goes, "Let this same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus." Well, what mind is that? Who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, something to be used. But he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, a doulos. Again, probably the NIV says servant there, I would imagine. So very poignant and powerful. He takes on the role of a slave. And then it says, he is born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death on a cross. Roman citizens weren't crucified. It was only those insurrectionists, only those terrorists, and only those slaves that rebelled that were crucified. And so there would be hundreds of crucifixions during a year. It's not just like it was a one-time thing. This was something that was done, and it was a treatment against those slaves that many of the people owned. But Jesus takes that on as a self-definition. Then verse 9 says, "Therefore God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." The ultimate exodus. He is exited beyond just this role of a slave. He has an exodus from death itself. And he has been exalted and he becomes Lord. And then it says, "Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who's at work in you, enabling you to will and to work for his good pleasure." This passage, I think, helps us to see that the end is not permanent slavery. God exalts Jesus, who uh, showed himself to be a slave, accepted it, and God delivered him from it. And now we're beginning to see the New Testament is taking it farther than the Old Testament. And what we see is, even though Jesus uses the poignant image of a doulos, slave, in many of his teachings, that's really not the heart of what he is trying to say in his teachings, because we see in his self sacrifice that he is allowing himself to be killed to be then vindicated by God. Now, Paul, on the other hand, I mentioned this a little bit ago, will recognize this term doulos, and he'll use it to his advantage as well. In 1 Corinthians 7:23, he says, "You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human masters." Interesting. Christ has freed you from being enslaved to sin and that type of thing. But Paul never ever says that those who are slaves should be set free. This is in verse 22 of the same chapter. "For whoever was called in the Lord as a slave is a free person belonging to the Lord." He's set free, but that's a spiritual relationship. "Just as whoever was free was called as a slave of Christ." You have a new master. That master is Christ. Therefore, leaders are not to lord it over others in their role, but rather serve other people. Now you're seeing progress. Now, and you're looking at the trajectory of the scriptures from the beginning all the way through the ministry of Jesus to the end. Now, here's some thoughts I have for you. Dealing with slavery in the Bible involves confronting difficult and uncomfortable realities in the human experiment. How do we get along with each other? Do we honor one another, love one another, or use one another? And what makes it complex is there is no direct condemnation of slavery. It's a common institution, and slaves could be typical servants or laborers. Some of them could even have become managers in different ways, but not all of them. Some of them were actually bought and sold. Um, Now, here's the problem. It's right here. The Bible was often used uh, uh, for pro-slavery advocates, and you can see they had plenty of text to work with to justify uh, slavery in the United States. This one, I think, though, helps us the most. So Paul writes a letter, and he is writing to a slave owner, actually, by the name of Philemon. And as he writes, he is talking about a slave that ran away by the name of Onesimus. And so it's a short little letter. He writes to Philemon and he says, to Philemon, our dear friend and co worker. So he sees him as a partner. Then he goes on and he gives thanks for him. And then finally, you come to verse 10. And here's what he's really trying to do with this little letter. He says, I'm appealing to you for my child, Onesimus. Ah, do you see that? My boy, Onesimus, for my child, Onesimus, whose father I have become during my imprisonment. Onesimus isn't a little boy, he's a grown man, but he became like a son to Paul. Formerly, he was useless to you. Why was he useless? Because he must have been a little bit belligerent toward Philemon. All right. Didn't want to do what Philemon asked him to do. He was useless to you, but now he is indeed useful both to you and to me. I'm sending him back, my own heart, back to you. I wanted to keep him with me so that he might be a service to me in your place during my imprisonment for the gospel, but I preferred to do nothing without your consent in order that your good deed might be voluntary and not something forced. Perhaps this is the reason he was separated for you for a little while, so that he might, so that you might have him back forever. Do you see that language there that resembles some of the things we already talked about? But this is the one, verse 16. That's the creme de la creme of this letter. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. So if you ever want to look at for a verse that really leapfrogs past what we've seen so far in the New Testament, this is the verse. Paul sends Philemon, Onesimus, and says, receive him back, but not just as a slave. Receive him back as a brother. And implied in that is treat him like a brother. Treat him like a brother. Don't treat him like a slave. Why did he run away in the first place? That's a great question. Was he being mistreated by Philemon? Don't know. But overall, what I think you see in the Bible is a movement from Exodus liberation of the Israelites to the equalizing message of Jesus that is moving the ball down the field. It is moving this subject closer and closer and closer to emancipation. And so maybe a way to think about it is like this: the Exodus from Egypt um, to the promise of freedom that they have in the promised land. Then in the New Testament, it becomes kind of like spiritual freedom, um, freedom in Christ and redemption and all those other type of terms. So here's what I think you can conclude with. I think Jesus's perspective on slavery is not really singular as used in his parables and teachings. It is it's a multi perspective. Why do I know that? Because of his emphasis on love and compassion. Because of his command to love your neighbor as yourself, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this you see in every encounter. Jesus always had humane treatment of other people. And I think when you add those three things together, I think that's what you say, okay, Jesus is not in approval of owning other people, using other people, and mistreating other people. And then you allow history to continue to develop and move that forward till you get to the civil rights movement in our own country and the Emancipation Proclamation, and then working toward equality and those type of things, which is still being pushed back upon in certain sections of our society. But nonetheless, if we can pray that God will continue to allow us as human beings to move this topic forward, eventually we will get to a place of the absolute exodus for all people, not just one group of people. So, all right, let me stop our recording, and I'll stop our share so we can see one another. And let me see what you think about this topic. Do you have questions? Do you have concerns? Do you have insights that you'd like to mention? Anybody?
Very interesting, Larry.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, isn't it?
You know, I've always liked Philemon, the letter, but I think Paul was a lot more heavy-handed than you described in there.
Well, I agree.
I mean, he was just
for the guy that for the guy that writes the love chapter of the New Testament, he had a hard side to him. He really did. I mean,
he was basically telling him, "You better do this."
I think you also see in Paul an evolution too, and I think you have to remember he was a Pharisee at one time. Right in the book of Philippians, we see, he really he waves that flag. I'm a Pharisee of the Pharisees. But by the time you get to the end of his life, you see a softer side of him. And I think, send me help while I'm in prison, and different things that are coming clear, that he has kind of opened his heart more than what he did initially. At least that's what I think. But some other thoughts? So when you read Jesus, when you read the teachings, or as in particular the parables, it's okay that Jesus uses really aggressive language, because that's what makes some of the points he's trying to make. It does not necessarily mean that's the way he actually perceives how to treat other people. Okay. You have to look at the compassion and empathy of Jesus to see that element. Anybody else have any other thoughts or questions? All right. Well, hope this was helpful, and we'll pick up another topic next Wednesday then. Sound okay?
Thank you.
Yep. I hope you have a great rest of the week. We'll see you all soon. Okay.
You too.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.